The death of God is about the drying up of a horizon of meaning and of a whole form of human life.
Philip Cunliffe is Associate Professor of International Relations at the Department of Risk and Disaster Reduction, University College London. He is the author of 7 books, including Lenin Lives, Reimagining the Russian Revolution, 1917 to 2017, which came out from Zero Books while I was the editor there. He is a co-host at the Alpha Bunga Bunga podcast, and I'm glad to have him back on the podcast to discuss his recent essay in Compact called How Trump Won the Canadian Election. Philip, good to see you again.
Yeah, great to see you too, Doug, and glad to be back on Sublation.
Yeah, so you wrote this article, How Trump Won the Canadian Election, which I was immediately interested in. You know, one of our authors here at Sublation, Chris Catrone, probably the leading author at the moment at Sublation, wrote a pretty controversial piece for Compact about Greenland and Canada. It got a lot of interest, and it was even debated in, I think, I forget which publication it was, but mainstream New York journalists took note of his argument. And I was interested to see you in some ways echoing, in some ways very much disagreeing with Catrone's analysis. So how did Trump win the Canadian election? It seems like a contrarian point of view. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, so I mean, it is a contrarian point of view. The argument that I made was, so it was generally cast as this was a patriotic backlash on the part of the Canadian voters against Trump's annexationist rhetoric with regards to Canada, in that they voted Mark Carney, the Liberal leader, after he managed to turn around the opinion polls, which all seem to be pointing towards the Liberals being crushed in favour of the Tories. The voters exhausted with Justin Trudeau. And then it seems as if Mark Carney was leading a charge, a kind of a charge for liberal globalism, as against the kind of Trumpy nationalism and all the rhetoric that was coming out of south of the border. And in contrast to that story of the Canadian election, I suggested that, in fact, what was the most striking thing about the Canadian election was the fact that Carney won by appealing to Canada's sense of independent nationhood, defending Canadian sovereignty, defending Canadian national rights, defending Canadian interests in a very full-throated and confident way, completely out of keeping with the traditions of the Liberal Party, at least up until recently, and particularly under Justin Trudeau, and also not in keeping with Mark Carney's own career. If there's anyone who would, if you looked up globalist in the dictionary, it would be Mark Carney would be there on the photo. Somebody whose most prominent role prior to being elected Prime Minister was being Governor of the Bank of England, despite the fact that he's a Canadian citizen. As well as, being a private banker, a banker in Canada's financial institutions, appointed to all of those kind of creepy institutions, organizations associated with various functions of world economic governance and so on. And if reports are to be believed, he stood for the leadership of the Liberal Party on the advice of Tony Blair himself, the archetypal neoliberal globalist of the last 30 years. And so the fact that Carney had adopted this language of national independence, that he deployed kind of what, would be essentially Trump's own kind of language about national self-assertion, and deployed it against Trump, and to win such a significant majority and crushed the Tories in the election, speaks to the fact that that language, that discourse of national rights, national self-interest, national sovereignty has been absorbed by the people who opposed it. Like I say, the archetypal liberal globalists. So to that extent, despite the fact that there was this patriotic pushback against Trump's menacing of Canadian sovereignty, Nonetheless, he did, you could, as the title of the piece suggests, he won the election in as much as he's forced other states to adopt the language of defending their own rights as independent states, as nations with rights. And so that, in that sense, Trump won the Canadian election, despite the fact that it was cast as a pushback against Trump.
Well, I'm interested about this very notion of national sovereignty in this context. I sent you some questions ahead of time, and I'm just going to read the first one, and we can discuss it for a little while. In a society defined by internationalized capital, why is national sovereignty significant? And to add to that question, how can it even be understood to exist?
Yeah. So the most straightforward answer is that it's not only important but vital, because without it there is no politics. So without sovereignty there is no politics. Without state power there is no politics. Without state power that is worth contending over, there is, between organized factions within society, within civil society, there is no politics. And so state sovereignty, understood as a supreme claim to political authority over a given territory and people, a secular, distinctively secular claim to rule over that territory and people, that enshrines the very concept of modern political life. And so without that legally constituted, formally kind of constituted sphere of autonomous political right over a particular territory and over a given body of citizens, without that, there is no politics. And so it's important, I think, that, entirely in keeping with that understanding of sovereignty, that sovereignty has been so abominated over the last 30 years or so, that it has been variously delegitimized or undermined, and all these efforts have been made from various, both from the left and from the right, in various different ways to contain, limit, curb, and undermine sovereignty, whether that be through integrating states into vast kind of regional free trade agreements and organizations, whether that be NAFTA or the European Union, whether it be the growing assertiveness of transnational and supranational courts such as the ICC or the European Court of Justice in Europe, or indeed various kinds of or the international criminal tribunals associated with various UN efforts. Indeed, the way in which the UN has asserted greater authority and sway in world affairs, the rights that powerful states, mainly Western states, have claimed for themselves to intervene in the internal affairs of other countries, that they have the right to involve themselves in other countries' affairs on the grounds of human rights. The fact that so many people in Western states think of themselves as having human rights rather than having rights as citizens of given states. And then, that's without even mentioning the ways in which states have been locked into all sorts of curbs on their autonomy when it comes to the processes of economic globalization and the devolution of power. So we mentioned Mark Carney earlier as governor of the Bank of England. One of the most important functions of the neoliberal era was when New Labour came to power in 1997, the Chancellor at the time, Gordon Brown, made the Bank of England independent as a way of signaling to the markets that the monetary policy wasn't going to fall under the sway of democratically elected government. It was going to be under the control of appointed technocratic experts who would attempt to control the interest rate and the money supply in the UK without reference to the interests of elected officials. So all of that effort to dilute national sovereignty in various ways speaks to its significance and power, and the fact that I think it can be seen as a way to what it was. I think over that time was a kind of a sense they wanted essentially to wither away the political state, to wither away politics, so that all the functioning of the global economy would effectively be administrative, technocratic, and expert, with politics limited and contained as much as possible. And obviously that time, 30 to 40 years of neoliberal globalization is coming to an end. And so it's unsurprising that we see politicians claiming national rights in the way that they have, most strikingly, as I argued in the Compact piece, with Mark Carney in the Canadian election.
Okay, so I live in Oregon, which is a state in the United States, and Oregon has its own constitution. But we operate under the federal constitution, the U.S. Constitution. We have limited sovereignty as Oregonians. The city of Portland has limited sovereignty within the city. What constitutes true sovereignty? And just to complicate it a little further, I'm just, saying sort of obvious things. The United States has sovereignty, but if there were to be an international rule of law, like an international world order, let's say directed by the UN, if that were to actually happen, and and they could be in these rules and laws could be enforced, U.S. sovereignty would be limited in some ways. But I would still think it constituted some sort of sovereign nation, even if we could, if we were facing tribunals for war crimes, or politicians were. So the question of sovereignty, it seems to me to be complicated at the very least under international capitalism. The other thing I'll raise the other thing after. I'll just put that forward to you. What do you think?
Yeah.
About that? So
I mean, I think it's a mistake to think of federalism as. I guess maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but if the thrust of your question is that the federal system dilutes sovereignty, I think it's the other way around. That in fact it enhances sovereignty, or at least it can be seen to enhance sovereignty. In the sense that there is no the particular structures, depending on a given state with its given national history, the institutions of government within that state may be designed, or may not be designed in such a way to enhance the power of that state. So the question of whether federalism serves the purpose of diluting the sovereignty of a central state, or whether it serves the purpose of enhancing and magnifying the power of that sovereignty, which is to say, by getting the buy-in of that state's citizens, by virtue of the fact if they choose to live under a federal system that gives them a certain degree of flexibility and institutional variety across different states that comprise a federation, then in that case, in fact, by virtue of gaining that legitimacy and that buy-in, it in fact enhances the sovereignty of that state. And so, in my understanding of US federalism, the federal system of government in the US enhances the sovereignty of the Union, which was decided decisively in the Civil War. So if there hadn't been an effort to build a union, and the US had only existed under the Articles of Confederation as emerged in the early phases of the American Revolution, it probably wouldn't, then talking in terms of national sovereignty probably would be fairly meaningless if that arrangement had stayed intact. But given the fact that arrangement was unstable and viable, and then had to be, a federal federation had to be created, and then the sovereignty of the Federation of the Union was established through the process of the Civil War itself. That sovereignty lay with the Union and not with the constituent states. That question of national sovereignty was decided in favor of the Union. I wouldn't say that. I don't think it would be meaningful to say that Oregon has sovereignty, given the fact, in any kind of real way, in the fact that it's a member of a larger federation whose overall legitimacy I don't think is in any serious doubt. But to that degree, I think it magnifies the strength and the sovereignty in the sense of that political authority for collective self-rule, by virtue of the fact of getting legitimacy and buy-in through that arrangement, which, thus far is the one that American citizens choose to live under.
I mean, if Oregon wanted to have true sovereignty, we would secede, or at the very least, we would develop, say, enough power and militias to be able to resist the federal government if they were trying to impose, the federal government was trying to impose laws or policies on the state that the people of Oregon didn't agree with. But there's no serious move in that direction in Oregon. So does sovereignty come down to the development of enough military might in order to protect your political interests as opposed to some other political body's authority and power?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think this is something which I think often there is, so in my discipline, my academic discipline of international relations, there is often this notion that, that sovereignty is measured by how much military power, and that resolves itself as how many tanks or how many people you have under arms or how many nuclear missiles you might have and so on. And I think that is to misconceive it, or at least it's only to see it in a one-sided way, because the capacity to defend yourself, at least, if not the capacity to attack others, at least the capacity to defend yourself requires a certain degree of legitimacy, political legitimacy and political authority. And so, it's for reasons like that, say that Vietnam could beat the US in the Vietnam War because of the political authority that the National Liberation Front in Vietnam, seeking to unify the Vietnamese nation, that they could call upon, and that ultimately was greater. They had greater willpower to win than the US, despite the fact that the US was obviously materially more powerful. So it is a matter of, it does resolve itself as a matter of force, like you say. If Oregon chose to secede from the United States, it would require to defend itself. But its capacity to defend itself successfully would depend on the extent to which it had enjoyed the legitimacy and support of its citizens and how far they would be willing to go to defend Oregonian independence. So on this point, it resolves itself ultimately in the Hegelian formula of highest right makes highest might. The greater the legitimacy and the greater the authority of a polity, the greater power that it will be able to exercise for itself and in defense of its own interests if it came to a military conflict.
Right. And after the American Revolution, during the American Revolution, the revolutionaries required assistance from France in order to gain their independence. And after the American Revolution, efforts were made to basically to tie American interests to Britain again and to get support there in terms of trade, but also through military agreements. Like I would imagine if Oregon were to secede, it would immediately seek to form some sort of treaty with the United States and rely on the United States military might to protect its interests as it's within what had been the landmass of the United States. So it can't just be the only sovereign there is the nation with the greatest military might, right? There's always agreements made between nations. I guess I'm gonna go to this next question. What is the basis for a nation's claim to sovereignty, if it's not simply its ability to defend itself militarily or to put force into on the ground, and in the case of Canada, given how recently it actually gained its independence, and its recent history of embracing globalism, how sovereign is it, or how much of a will is there in Canada truly towards sovereignty?
Yeah, so the I mean, you're right, and it's always there's always a risk in these discussions about sovereignty. There's the instinct to kind of collapse it into this idea of an impossible political self-sufficiency, like on the model of North Korea or Enver Hoxha's Albania. And again, I mean, I think that that view, I think, is kind of a legacy of the globalist era, to equate, or to conflate, rather, I should say, political self-sufficiency with economic self-sufficiency, because the two things do not need to go together at all. You can have political self-sufficiency can coexist with all manner of complicated institutional arrangements, legal agreements that are treaties between states, are ultimately contracts that they voluntarily enter into, or indeed economic trading arrangements. So the question of when those institutions might subvert or undermine or call into question the sovereignty of a state, obviously, I mean, that's a matter of, that is something which has, you can debate it politically, and ultimately it's for the citizens of a given state themselves to decide how far their sovereignty has been compromised. But political self-sufficiency is the basis on which a state can enter into a treaty. And I think part of the problem of the last 30 years is that treaties have been souped up. So rather than these voluntary compacts, which states enter into out of mutual self-interest in order to both benefit, you have the effort to institutionalize treaty systems to make them more difficult to withdraw from, and also to the clauses in various ways act to undermine the functioning and independence of the members of the particular treaty system. And so the two classic examples would be NATO or the EU. Technically, the European Union is nothing more than the series of treaties that each state has voluntarily agreed to participate in. In practice, though, the way in which those treaties function is very much to remove that political self-sufficiency, or indeed, similarly with NATO, that the way in which it's technically a self-defense, an alliance for mutual self-defense, but in practice, through the force of repetition, through the growth of bureaucratic institutions over and above the state, through the way in which the state integrates its own apparatuses into these transnational structures, means that it grows into something which is bolted onto, effectively as to coin a phrase, an excrescence on an excrescence, right? So it ends up being this kind of outgrowth, which is no longer meaningfully like just a voluntary compact that you can withdraw from. And that was proved by how tortuous the process of Brexit was in the UK. Even though you can voluntarily withdraw from the European Union, it turns out to be a tremendously complicated and difficult process, proving the fact that it had actually had grown vastly beyond its starting point as just this set of treaty systems voluntarily entered into. So on the question of Canada, what is the basis of any nation's sovereignty? It is that sense of, it has to include a degree of that sense of political self-sufficiency, that a given people in a given territory agree to be ruled by a certain set of institutions and accept the authority and supremacy of those institutions. In Canada's case, it seems to me like the basis of Canadian sovereignty at the moment seems to be largely in opposition to Trump. So in 2017, like Justin Trudeau said, Canada was a post-national country, in the sense that he meant it like it had kind of, the sense of it, as with everything with Trudeau, was that it kind of elevated itself into a higher plane of morality, and it transcended all the petty rivalries of mere nation states. It was something greater and grander. And that, he said that in 2017, it was very clearly formulated in opposition to what was happening south of the border with Trump's first election the previous year. And so when Trudeau said that, he wanted to claim that Canada was something more than just merely a kind of a state like any other. It had some kind of greater claim or authority or moral superiority. And in fact, it turns out that it doesn't. Carney's election proves, in fact, that Canadians felt jealous of their sovereignty when it was threatened by their larger, more powerful neighbor to the south. And they were willing to assert that feeling through voting in, keeping the Liberals in office.
Right. You earlier said that sovereignty has to do with the state being able to make a claim over certain citizenry or civilian population. But I wonder if it's true also that sovereignty has to be based on the power of the people to have some say over the government. You mentioned that one of the difficulties with the EU was the way in which it had become ossified into institutionalized bureaucracies that operated on some basis other than politics. And by that, I think you mean other than through democratic elections and having to listen to and meet the demands of the people of Europe. So if that's the case, if it's the case that sovereignty has to be based on representation, representing the people, could you imagine the EU as a sovereign nation? Which and if it had been set up more along those lines, would it have been a violation of the sovereignty of, say, France or England, or to get into that arrangement? And how seriously should the people of France take that violation of that sovereignty if they actually had a way to control and direct the federal government of the EU?
So it's certainly, I mean, it is the most sovereignty enshrines that, like you say, that most basic political claim, at least in modern political systems of representation, that interests, you have delegates who are appointed to act on your behalf. And that is even more foundational in a sense than even democracy, because you can have a sovereign state that is not democratic, but you can't have a democratic state that is not sovereign. You have to have, without sovereignty, there can be no meaningful collective self-government or democratic procedure in that government. So, I mean, this was like you've pointed out something about the European Union, which is very important to grasp, I think, particularly for those who are maybe who are outside of the EU. It is not a federation. At best, you could say it's a would-be confederation, that it aspires to be a confederation, but it's not a federation. It has no single point of centralized authority or sovereignty that claims rights over all the people in its territory. And to that degree, it's not. It does not have the legitimacy that would come with sovereignty, and this is very evident, in its political structure. It has, instead of the concentration of power in a single kind of center that you get with sovereignty in the EU, you have these competing multiple centers of power. And you have the European Court of Justice, which has rights to enact law in the European Union. What it says is the law, but there is no way to check the European Court of Justice. So the comparison to the US would be if the Supreme Court can interpret a point of law in the Constitution, but if there is a mechanism for changing the Constitution, and then the Supreme Court would have to abide by whatever the Constitution said. Whereas in the EU, precisely because there is no articulated political centralization in terms of power and authority, and no procedure by which the sovereignty of the Union is expressed, the ECJ is in the position of being able to create law with no reference, in fact, to elected representatives, even within the European Parliament. So, I mean, this is the reason. So I was involved in campaigning around Brexit in the aftermath of the vote after 2016, when Britain voted to leave the European Union. And this was one of the reasons that I campaigned for it, was because there is no prospect of a sovereign state being formed in the European Union. And that is, it's not only a matter of lack of organization and lack of will and capacity, but it's built into the functioning of the EU itself. It was designed not to supplant. It wasn't designed to create a greater sovereignty. It was designed rather to disorganize and undermine the sovereignty of the nation states of Europe. It was designed to evade democratic accountability to the citizens of Europe. And if it created a sovereignty and supplanted the sovereignty of the nation states of Europe, it would have simply reproduced the problem, because then you would have had a single super state, a single federal state in Europe. Everyone in Europe would have been a citizen, and then you'd have had the same problem. The EU would have to be accountable to the citizens of Europe as citizens of this new federation. And so that is exactly what the European Union was designed to avoid. There is a very small number of pro-EU federalists who support the EU on the basis that it can become a sovereign federation in the future. And I always felt that they were the ones who had my kind of grudging respect as political opponents in the debate, because they wanted a sovereign Europe. And if I thought there was some kind of realistic possibility of that, a greater, more inclusive state in the continent of Europe that gave equal rights to the peoples of Europe in a greater expanse with greater political sway and authority, I'd be more than happy to countenance such a vision. But that was not a realistic prospect, despite the hopes of a few kind of forlorn European federalists. So, yes, the EU subverts the sovereignty of its member states. It undermines the rights of sovereign states, but it doesn't supplant them, or it doesn't relate to the citizens of the member states the way that the federal government relates to citizens of Oregon. And that is why the EU is so noxious to anyone who would stand for freedom and democracy. That is why the EU is anathema to those things, because it is never going to become a sovereign state of any kind. It is expressly intended to make democracy within its member states impossible by undermining the national sovereignty of those states.
Earlier, you said that you can have a state that has sovereignty, but that is not democratic, but you can't have a democratic state that doesn't have sovereignty, right? And so if we were to imagine the European Union gaining sovereignty without being particularly democratic, I guess it would still have to claim or maintain even some legitimacy, right? So I'm wondering what constitutes sovereignty ultimately. We've gone over some of the things that sort of do and sort of don't, like military might, it's what creates the ability for a nation to have sovereignty, but it doesn't have to be the most powerful military. It has to be powerful enough to, in the moment, make it inconvenient or not worth the trouble for another nation to take it over, right? So it might need to have autonomy economically, but not so much autonomy that it doesn't rely on trading partners for its goods. Some even very necessary goods like food. You can have a sovereign nation like Japan that really relies on imported food, but it's still sovereign. So I'm wondering about, is this question of legitimacy the central question? And if so, how can we distinguish between a truly sovereign EU in our imagination and what we have now, given that it seems to have had some kind of legitimacy up to maybe the point of Brexit, or maybe its legitimacy is collapsing. So what does it take to have legitimacy, I guess is the question I'm asking ultimately.
Yeah, so the EU has tried to get its legitimacy through what political scientists sometimes call output legitimacy, in terms of providing certain kinds of goods, as opposed to input legitimacy, which is the means by which certain decisions or outcomes are decided you get the buy-in of the people who are affected by the decisions, and that would be input legitimacy. And so the EU knows that the question of input legitimacy has always been tremendously difficult for it, for the reasons that I said, that it was expressly designed as a neoliberal apparatus to undermine democracy at the national level. And so it's focused on output legitimacy, which is things like, kind of making it more convenient for you when you go abroad from France to Germany or Italy or whatever, that you can use the same mobile phone network or cell phone network, as you guys call it, without kind of difficulty. So it's that kind of consumer-oriented vision of legitimacy. And that's the way the EU tries to kind of become legitimate, or saying like, it makes it easier for people to work in different countries. Kind of it's an output legitimacy, but it's not a citizenship right. And that's an important difference. And it's one of the comparisons by which the EU always suffered with comparison to the US. So if you look at rates of mobility in the US, they're quite high. People will move across the country for work. They'll go to all different parts of the country for tourism, but the willingness to move to work from one end of the country to another is quite common in the US, at least, when I looked at the data last, when these debates came up around Brexit, whereas it's very uncommon in the EU. And that's because people don't think of it as a single integrated political space. For the most part, people live and work in the countries of which they're citizens, rather than the European Union, thinking of it as a single space. So it does not have the idea for sovereignty is to combine that input and output legitimacy, whereas the EU has tried hard to develop output legitimacy precisely because it knows that it can't claim input legitimacy. So the legitimacy of any given sovereign state, ultimately, it rests on how far it is seen to be an authoritative representative of the people that it claims to govern, as modeled on the idea of a social contract. The citizens combine to create a higher governing authority in order to manage their mutual relations and represent and defend their collective interests on their behalf. That modern idea of sovereignty derives from all the classical kind of contractarian political philosophies. And that is something the EU doesn't have and doesn't really claim either, in contrast to, the sovereignty that's claimed by the US Union.
Well, it does strike me that one of the reasons why, say, a German might not decide to move to France to live and work is because of the language barrier. I mean, I know that Europeans speak multiple languages, or are more likely to, than people in the United States, but nonetheless, it seems to me that would present a barrier. Is there any evidence that if there was, if we were to imagine that we just imposed English on all of Europe, or imposed French on all of Europe, that it would remain the case that people would be less mobile than in the United States? Another way to think of it, maybe more grounded in reality, is what is the rate of mobility between English-speaking Canada and French-speaking Canada? Or do people tend to stay in the areas where their language is spoken?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know what internal rates within Canada are. If I had to hazard a guess, I'm sure they'd be higher. Well, I'd confidently guess that they're higher than they are within the EU, for the reasons kind of that we've already talked about.
Right.
So the question with the sovereignty, so in the EU, the idea is that there are the four so-called freedoms. And one of them, they are of goods, services, finance, and labor. And so the idea is that any person in the EU can live and work and choose to set a business and go and work wherever they like within the territory of the European Union. But that's not the right of a citizen in the way that it is in the US or in Canada. That is devised as freedom for factors of production. And that's very explicitly embedded in the idea of the single market. So people can move within the territory of the European Union, and if they speak the language or whatever, they'll find it easier, obviously, to get a job wherever it might be. But it is not a citizen. It is not the right of a citizen to live and work where they please in a single integrated territory. It is rather understood as helping to facilitate market integration by facilitating freely flowing factors of production. And so it treats its citizens effectively purely as labor. So if they're not really citizens at all. They are simply laborers from the concept of the European Union. And so, that question of Germans in France not speaking the language, that's the question of the early modern state itself. When the early modern state was formed, in particular in a place like France, it confronted these problems of having all these regional dialects, kind of provincial backgrounds between Brittany in the north and the Languedoc in the south, and the Basque country, and as well as the kind of more German-oriented territories in the east of France and what have you. And so, by way of establishing the central unitary authority of the sovereign state in France, it required standardizing the language, required standardizing education, systems of measurement, systems of government, the laws across the country. And that was a very important part of the revolutionary legacy in France itself. And so, to answer your question is, if there was a sovereign claim, a sovereign authority within Europe, it would undertake the necessary measures that would allow for that degree of national integration within that territory. And so, whether it took the form of German becoming more widely spoken, or French becoming more widely spoken, or whatever it might be, or Esperanto or whatever, that would be part of that process of building, of nation building under a sovereign authority, just as happened in the cases of Italy, in Germany, and in France. But we don't, that's not happening, and it won't happen for the reasons that I say. It's not a sovereign state, and it does not wish to be a sovereign state, because if it did, it would only find itself in this reproducing the problem that the EU is designed to avoid, which is democratic accountability.
Right. But we can, there are nations now who are sovereign nations that do not provide the citizens with inputs or are not democratically accountable. And so it does seem to me a lot of the arguments here around the necessity of sovereignty are connected also to this, love of democracy and the need for democratic participation. And so sovereignty alone isn't what we're striving for. But
no, absolutely not. Yeah. So sovereignty is no guarantee of democracy, but you can't have democracy without sovereignty, because you need, if democracy is to work at all, and again, this was, proof. If anyone needed proof, they could find them in the debates and the process of Brexit very recently. But it's kind of borne out in the history of the last 300 to 500 years. But yes, sovereignty is a necessary but insufficient part of democracy. But you can't have democracy unless you have a supreme center of political authority with no higher power above it, where the decision ultimately rests, and there is finality to that decision. And that is what you need for democracy. You need to have a democratic decision needs to be enforced once it's made. And it also needs to be, it can't be subverted by some higher power outside the sovereignty of the state, whether that be another state, whether that be, kind of theological power, as in the kind of the old transnational claim of the papacy to superiority over the nations of Europe, whatever it might be. So you need that ultimate supreme center of political authority if you're going to have any kind of finality and meaning to democratic decision making.
Yeah, in the United States, I think the what gives the federal government its legitimacy and authority is the Constitution. Ultimately, it's the way in which the citizens are convinced that the separation of powers and the Bill of Rights say protect them from tyranny and give them the power to have democratic participation and control over the government.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so if that alone can be the basis for sovereignty, and let's say that the U.S. Self-conception is accurate. I mean, it's not entirely accurate, right? We're not truly democratic in the United States, and the power of government has over the people has grown and grown, and bureaucratized as well. But if nonetheless a pitch were made to the Canadian people on that basis by someone who wasn't Trump, how committed do you think the Canadians would ultimately be to Canadian sovereignty, given how unpopular Trudeau's government was and the degree to which the Canadian Constitution, such as it exists, is less protects the citizenry from governmental tyranny to a lesser degree, that doesn't have the free speech rights in Canada are bridged by the state in a way that they are not in the United States. Is this a love of democracy in Canada that's pushing Carney forward, or is it just a kind of patriotism?
Yeah, it's I mean, I guess Canadians would be better placed to answer it, but it seems to me, at least, as an observer, but it seems that the real the basis for it is a feeling of Canada's distinctiveness as a country in its own right. And I mean what was striking to me was the fact that, so for instance, the claim was made by Trump that, Canada is the 51st state. If you ran with that idea of Canada as the 51st state, it would be, Canada is the second largest country in the world by landmass. So this single most enormous state with a huge population, but that would also obliterate all the internal distinctions within Canada itself if Canada became a single state as part of the United States. Mm-hmm. Not least the differences between French-speaking Quebec and the rest of the English-speaking part of Canada, which obviously very important to many Canadians and historically have been important to Canada's development as a country. But also, I mean, my understanding is, that Canadians feel attached to their provinces, Alberta and so on, and Quebec and Ontario, whatever, in a way that's similar to Americans' own feeling of attachment to their states. And so all of that would be erased, if Canada were to become a single state of an enlarged United States. And so the question seems to me to be, I'm certainly sympathetic to what you say. The Canadian citizens enjoy fewer rights by virtue of not having the kinds of rights that US citizens have embedded in the Constitution. But Canadians, for better or for worse, they have the feeling of national right. And that's what matters to them, seemingly in the strength of the reaction against Trump's claims on their territory and independence. So,
I would just say this is just me speaking as a, ugly American here, that the Canadians' identity as an independent nation is defined by not being American and nothing more. They would be glad to be part of the British Commonwealth again, or to be welcomed into the EU, as long as they didn't have to think of themselves as Americans, or as part of the United States. I mean, and when I say that, I'm only speaking of people who I've met who are of my tribe on the left, in Canada. So I think that it's a rather thin sort of nationalism that we're talking about when it comes to Canada. And when Carney met with Trump, he was saying, "Oh, we're never going to be part of the United States," and Trump said, "Well, we'll never take you by force, but let's see where things go in 5 to 10 years." That was his answer. I can't imagine that there's going to be an annexation of Canada within my lifetime, but my imagination might be more limited than Trump's. I don't really know. But I want to go to something else that you said at the start, which is that without sovereignty and a certain kind of nationalism, there can't be politics. But from my perspective, there can be a politics of socialism that takes place in all of the EU, as maybe opposed to the EU, but that isn't based primarily on national identity or even claims for sovereignty, but rather the working class power instead, or the rights of, to put it in like a bourgeois terms, in American terms, just the rights of the citizens to have control over their destiny and by extension then the government. So that's a different kind of politics, but you would argue that that kind of politics requires demands for state sovereignty, national sovereignty.
It's not, I wouldn't even say that it requires demand for state sovereignty. It can only exist in the context of state sovereignty. So the vision that you suggest is the vision, more or less, that was proposed by people like Yanis Varoufakis, who is a member of the Greek Syriza, the kind of populist left Syriza government in 2015. And it's the trap or the glue trap, which the left in Europe has just been unable to extricate itself from, is because they're enraptured by this kind of cosmopolitan vision of the European Union, this idea that it is this greater territory on which claims for socialism can be fought for, can be claimed, and in which a greater kind of sense of solidarity can be developed, as against the kind of petty national chauvinism, which is betrayed and which has so terribly afflicted European history over the course of the 20th century. But it's not. A citizen needs to claim a right with respect to a sovereign state. And given that there is no sovereignty within Europe, then there is no center of power against which right can be claimed, or against which a higher authority can be claimed, legitimacy. The claim of the European Union is for transnational or supranational authority, just to say, the Latin origin for supra is above, and it's authority above the nation. Whereas the classical kind of socialist understanding of those relations was internationalism, with inter the prefix obviously being between nations. And it's that, I think, which has been displaced. The left has allowed to have been displaced over the course of the last 30 to 40 years. That internationalism, in fact, requires the cooperation of independent nations that willingly choose to embrace their collective life together as independent nations. But that is what has been confiscated by the European Union and replaced instead by an idea of supranationalism. And the left has gone along with this, and it has embedded this development, and it has traduced the understanding of internationalism, and been happy to see the European Union displace that classical ideal of international cooperation with kind of bureaucratic obfuscation and subversion at the transnational and supranational level. And most of that is on the basis of hostility to working class people in the member states of the European Union, who remain stubbornly attached to their nation states and their national capitals, because they understand, I think, better than the left, and certainly better than many left activists. They understand that their rights, the few rights, political rights that they can have, given the parlous state of organized working class representation, the few vestigial rights that they can claim are political rights in the context of their nation states, and those have to be claimed against the transnational authority of the European Union. So, the vision that you kind of outline, as beautiful as it is, I think, unfortunately, the vision that has lured the left into a terrible, an ugly swamp in Europe from which it has failed to extricate itself. And the truth is, it has also gone there out of revulsion with the stubbornly national attachments of working class people across Europe, whether that be Romania, Italy, France, Germany, Britain, Spain. And it's that disgust, it's seen what is kind of just a very ordinary sense of political citizenship and feeling and national feeling, old-fashioned kind of national patriotism and feeling and attachment to the state where you kind of can exercise your political rights, is seen by the left as a stubborn kind of xenophobic backwardness and racism and potential fascism. I mean, I'm sure you can.
Yeah. Well, I wasn't trying to take the honest for Fairfax's position. Maybe I did inadvertently.
No, just to be clear, I understand kind of that's not where you were, that's not what you would, I'm not suggesting that you share that view, of the European working class, far from it. But I'm saying that the, that kind of view is, in fact, as a matter of fact, it is in Europe, for the actual existing left, it's based on hostility to the working class.
Well, right now, Sublation is aligned with something called the Campaign for a Socialist Party. And the idea of the Campaign for a Socialist Party is that over the next 5 to 10 to 20 years, the campaign will build up enough of a base in society, enough of a connection to working class people in various cities and counties throughout the United States that they'll be able to actually have enough support from the people to have a legitimate socialist party. It won't just be a group of intellectuals proclaiming themselves to be a party and then waiting for the workers to show up, but rather we'll do it the other way around. And then if we did manage to achieve a socialist party with a mass base and that was actually accountable to working people, we would then proceed to try to take political power on that basis. And if we were to have a revolution, it would be done on the basis of independence of working class people from the current state. I wonder if that would require us to argue for national sovereignty.
I think it'd be premised on national sovereignty because the point, there's got to be, for there to be politics at all, there has to be a center of political power that's worth fighting over. And I think one of the great achievements of neoliberalism over the last 30 to 40 years has been to make political power worthless and therefore not worth contending for. So to diffuse political power, either transferring it upwards into the supranational kind of bodies, devolving it downwards, or letting it kind of bleed out from the side, which is the the classic administrative state. Whereas I think as a part of that process of the revitalization of political life per se, it requires a concept of state sovereignty. I mean, I think even just as just as a logical predicate, let alone as a kind of conscious striving, So if political power is worth contending, then you need a center of sovereign power that is worth fighting over. And if there is no center of sovereign power, then there is no possibility of politics. And that has been our condition, I think, in the world at large, and certainly in the Western world over the last 30 years, that political power has not been worth contending. If it is worth contending, you need to have a sovereign state, and then you can have a fight over what you want to do with that state power. But if the state is so held in such contempt, in the sense that it's not even seen as worth exercising political power, or it's seen as kind of a limited, just this kind of parochial, limited place, which is so much less important than the United Nations or the fight for global climate justice or globalizing the Intifada or whatever it might be, then there's no possibility of any meaningful political life.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that in many ways, because what you're speaking to, I think, primarily is the way in which the EU or the UN are not accountable. They're not legitimate. They're not democratic. And so I do think that I would concur with at least that much. I do wonder about the possibility of, let's say, after revolution starts to kick off, in my, it's only in my imagination at this point, of some sort of international party claiming sovereignty over all the working people in the world and being accountable to them all, without, where nations would remain, but it would be a federated system. It would be with centralized authority through the party, but the party would also be spread out across the globe. Just how I think of it.
Yeah, I mean, so my understanding, my view of internationalism would be that it requires that independent nationhood. And as a classical understanding of the cooperation, internationalism is the cooperation between independent nations. And that can, and from there, that can evolve into a kind of a new federalism that would be larger and grander on a global, potentially on a global or vast regional scale that transcends what we have at the moment. But there's no getting there, I think. If we do indeed want to get there, there's no getting there without a commitment to independent nationhood, and with it, the idea of state sovereignty, the idea of political power that has to be defend the rights of political authority that have to be defended, fought over, exercised, and wielded.
All right. Well, I think we've worked out our mutual understanding and the degree to which we have a disagreement really well. And I'm going to end it there. But thank you very much, Philip, for coming on to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Doug.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons help to make sure that Sublation Media can continue to provide interviews, videos, books, and articles that are critical of the left from the left. If you are tired of remaining stuck within bourgeois ideologies and politics, help us sublate them both.